Okay, so some styler and app tips and tricks for you. So in a sort of quick question poll out there, we came back with a few things that people wanted to know more about. So what I wanted to talk about today is give a quick overview of the translated gentext feature inside styler. Have a look at the HTML configuration stuff, which is within styler, and then have a closer look at the app print config files, because there's a lot of mystery surrounding those things, and you can do some pretty cool and neat things during your publishing process with the print config files. So as I said, I'll probably talk fairly quickly. There's a lot to cover, but if you want any more information about any of the stuff I'm talking about, give me a shout and I'm happy to talk to you about it. So the translated gentext feature has been inside styler for quite a while now. The idea of it is that you might have a lot of generated text inside your style sheet and you want to send that out to a translator. So how do you go about doing that? Well, there's a way of setting up your style sheet so that it can use different languages, and there's ways of handling the translations within it and sending, generating XLIF files and importing XLIF files, and then seeing what the status is. So I wanted to give a quick overview of what's going on there. So the first thing you would need to do is to set up your style sheet for using different languages, and you do that on the Languages tab in style sheet properties. So there's a bunch of different fields in there, so I was going to talk through that. Really the starting point is this source language. So this source language specifies the base language that your generated text is going to be written in. So if you're writing in English, you would say English. If you're writing in French, you would say French there. Then the next little box is what the target languages is of your content. So you will want to, like in Europe, for example, you target French, German, Spanish, Russian, Dutch, a whole bunch of different languages. And you would list those here. What this list does is drives what languages you can export your generated text to. Okay. During publishing, the publishing process will look at this attribute that you specify up here on the language tab, and it will drive the replacement of the English version of the generated text with the specified language version of the generated text based on this attribute. So if your attribute is XML lang, then you would specify that there, and the switch during publishing would happen automatically. You can add target languages using this little button. You can remove them here. There's no need to specify any orders because it's a global thing. The next bit here is how you would map those different languages. So some languages like English, for example, you might have US English and you might have British English. Which one the correct one is, I'm sure you know which side of the fence I will fall on. But in German and Norwegian, for example, then you would have different sort of versions of that language. So you would specify in here how you would map your languages. Okay, so you can again add and edit the language mapping in that sort of area. Okay, so that's how you would set up your style sheet for using translated gentext. Then you would move on to the tools which sort of become available once you set that up. So in the Tools tab inside styler, you get a whole bunch of new features. Okay, in here there is this language properties idea, and that just pops up that tab again nice and easily. So you can do it from within this tab, menu, rather than going through the file style sheet properties thing. You have an option for exporting generated text. Okay, so this will create you an XLIF file of all the generated text for you to send to your translators. Then you have the import option. So if somebody's created some nice translations for you, you can import those into your style sheet and get those sort of embedded within there. Then you can view the translation status. I think I'll cover these again later on in the presentation. And then there's this awesome dialog box here which lists the translation defects. So let's have a look at those a little bit more. So the translation defects dialog is one of those things which gives you a whole load of information. So you can see from here where the generated text bit is, whether it's before text or after text, and which context that bit of gentext appears in. You can see which outputs it's targeted towards. Okay, so whether it's targeted towards a specific output, like RTF in this case, or whether it's targeted towards all of them. What language version of the translation you've got there, and what the status of it is. So it could be missing, in which case this is showing that there's not a Russian translation of this bit of gentext. But it could also be that it's complete and it's present, all that kind of stuff. You can also see the source of the translation. Okay, so with some of the generated text, you might not want to translate it, and it's perfectly fine for it to be missing. So if it's a bit of punctuation, for example, then you might not want to translate that. I'll talk about that again in a little while. Okay, I think that's everything in there. If you select one of these items within that tree, then you can go to it and you can make some changes to that bit of gentext if you want to, or you can display it, that kind of thing. Okay, so the translation defects dialog box is probably one of your best friends when you're working with translated gentext. It really is the sort of place where you can check where everything is up to date and as it should be. So when you are editing generated text and you have it all set up for translated gentext, there's an option in there for managing it within the generated text editing sort of dialog box. So there should be a new translation menu item, and you can do some things in here. This option here to add a note allows you to write a description about what that generated text bit is. So if your generated text is a little bit ambiguous, or you might want to explain what some of the terms mean particularly, then you can add a note to the translation item which gets generated, so you can explain to the translator what's going on inside there. You can also force the bit of generated text to be translated or not to be translated. So if the generated text just contains a product name, for example, there's no point sending out a product name just to be translated. You would mark that as do not translate. This option, which is on there by default, is to specify whether translation should happen based on the text content. So as I was mentioning earlier, if the gentext item only has punctuation, say it has a full stop or a comma or something, there's no need to generate that, and Style is smart enough to know that the content doesn't contain any words which need translating, so it would export it based on that. Of course, if you really want to force it not to be translated, you can specify that one. If you want to force it to be translated, then you can do it with the top item there. The options to export the generated text XLIF file is done through the tool that I mentioned earlier. When you do that, you get this little dialog box popping up. Okay, so you would specify a folder that you want to export your XLIF files to, and you would give it a base file name. So the base file name will be appended to depending on the language that you are exporting to. So for French, for example, it would add the _FR, German _DE, and so on. You can select to export all of the languages if you want to in one go, or you can specify the languages explicitly if you want to do that. And there's an option down here to only export the generated text which is missing a current translation. So if you've done one translation pass and you've got a whole load of translations in, then you can exclude those translated items in the next time you export your generated text. So you're not having to pay for it twice for the same translation. When the XLIF is created, you will see in the content you have this kind of structure within there. So the embedding of markup inside the XLIF file will make the XLIF file invalid. So this mechanism here is used to denote where markup would be, and the markup is specified in a notes section within the XLIF file. So the reader, the translator, will know that these markers actually mean there's some elements in there and what those elements are. When you come to importing the XLIF files, you would select them one at a time, and you would basically import the XLIF file, and it would replace the translated sections within your style sheet. When it does it, if there's areas which appear to be the same as the content which already exists within the style sheet, then you would get a warning pop up asking you whether you actually want to import that bit of translation because it appears to be untranslated. So you can specify that in there. When all of your import is complete, you'll get a translation status report, which will say which ones are current, which ones are not current, how many items remain untranslated, and when the last bit of translation was done. So that's pretty helpful too. We recognize that the translated generated text stuff is not complete, and one of the feedbacks that we had from last year's symposium was it'd be really nice to be able to see what the translations are in the generated text dialog box. So yeah, to be able to switch from the base language to one of the target languages like French, for example, be able to see what that translation looks like. So that is on our wish list. We have backlog created for it in our tracking system. So hopefully in the next release or two, we can get onto that and allow people to be able to see those generated text items. Cool. So the next thing I wanted to move on to was how to configure. Hang on, I think that was a question. Was that a question about translated gentext, Melissa?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Was there a question then about translated gentext? I don't have the question.
There was one question. Can I edit the XLF files myself for the styler translated gentext feature? Is that?
Yes. Yeah, yes. You can. You don't have to send it to a translator if you know the language yourself. You can do it yourself. Okay, so configuring HTML output. So over the years, we've done a lot of work to make the HTML output from Styler a lot more friendly, and to provide a lot of tools to our users to make it as such. And so what I wanted to do is have a quick refresher here on what is possible and what we can do and why we did it. So there are a number of things in here. A big area to look at is the style sheet properties for HTML files and chunks. There's a bunch of configuration items inside there which make the HTML output that you generate easier and nicer. Then there's the idea of custom JavaScript, and finally there's this HTML tag style category where you can modify the HTML that gets generated. So let's have a look at those in turn. So as I said, there's a bunch of options in the style sheet properties. I've selected HTML file, but there are equivalents in HTML chunk tab as well. So I'm going to talk through those individually. So the first ones to think about is how the CSS rules get generated for your HTML file. So there are two options under the first drop-down. The first one is to generate CSS for context and conditions, and the other one is to generate CSS based on property sets. So this is something that you should really consider if you're creating an HTML style sheet up front before you start applying any style, how you want your CSS to be generated. If you apply the context and conditions rule here, the CSS which gets generated will be based on the properties that you specify for the context and conditions. So therefore, you'll get some rather complicatedly named styles in your CSS, which will be sort of tricky to track. But the property values will be generated based on the properties that you specify for each of those context conditions. The second option there is to generate the CSS rules based on property sets. So when you're creating your style sheet, it's a good idea to use property sets as reusable style chunks. You can give them a sensible name, and you can tell Styler, when it's generating the CSS, to use those style names and the property values which are associated with those style names to generate your CSS. So rather than applying properties to the context and conditions, you would apply them only through property sets. What this does is makes your styling a lot more reusable. So your CSS is more compact, but it also makes it clearer and easier to read. So one of the net results of this is your HTML files will be a lot more simple and smaller. The other option here is to specify where the CSS gets generated. So there are two options here. You can either have it in the HTML header, so all the CSS information is embedded within the HTML file which gets generated, or you can output it into a separate file. My preference every time would be to generate it into a separate external file, and the links are generated to those external files from that. So that's pretty straightforward. The next options to look at is this idea of generating XHTML and HTML5. HTML5 by default is turned off, but I would always turn it on by default. You get access to a different set of HTML tags when you look at the HTML tags tab, and specifying XHTML ensures that the HTML that gets generated is well formed. There's also an option in here to specify semantic HTML rather than the use of divs and spans. If you know what you're doing when you're looking at HTML, the loads of divs and spans does get confusing. Being able to specify that a header is an H1, H2 tag, or divisions are specified as sections or articles in your HTML is a lot more readable and infers an awful lot more meaning for screen readers and reader accessibility kind of tools. Divs and spans don't really carry that kind of meaning, but headers, list items, that kind of thing definitely do. So if you want to create content which is accessible, then turn on the option to generate semantic HTML. Then you've got this idea of creating list items and titles as tables. So this has been done traditionally to ensure the formatting of list items where the bullet or the label of the list item is in a particular area and the content of the list item is in a different area. Same with titles. If you've got generated text labels at the front, like numbering or the word chapter in front of it, that kind of thing. I will now turn these off by default so that it would generate rather than a table, it would generate an H1 tag, for example, or a LI tag in the HTML that gets generated. Normally with HTML, you will have ways of specifying using the CSS how the list item looks, so you can override that kind of stuff if you want to. Before I move on to the JavaScript bit, I wanted to show you on my screen what the difference looks like. So this is, I created a fairly simple docbook kind of style sheet, and I left out all the HTML settings as they are out the box, and I output some HTML, and this is what it ended up looking like. So here we have all these styles which are generated based on the context conditions. They're all embedded at the top of the HTML file. And then as we look through the content, you can see there's lots of divs. Here's a title, which is styled as a table. Here's a set of divs. So this is a chapter section. This is the title. And here we've got a paragraph. Everything's contained within divs and within spans. after I've made all my changes, this is the sort of content that I get out of the back of it. So I'm using semantic HTML so I can see what this is a header and this is a paragraph, here's a section, that kind of thing. And this is an awful lot more readable. I've also chosen to put my CSS into an external file. There's the link to it here. And the CSS is based on property sets, so it's an awful lot more readable. So here's the property sets which I had just, defined in my style sheet, and you can see that those are considerably more readable. What I wanted to show you here is something that's sort of fairly funky and quite easy to. Oh, I don't have it open. Do I have it open? So inside Styler, there's an option for you to be able to export the CSS that would be generated for your style sheet. And if you notice at the top of here, you can point towards a custom style sheet. So this is applied automatically when you choose to use an external CSS file. And it has the suffix custom applied to it, and it allows you then to drop something into your HTML files folder, which has that name, and you can do something with it. So here I've got my custom file. I've exported some slightly different styling properties, and I've wrapped them all up in a media test in the CSS. And what that allows me to do, find my example. On a second, is no, wrong one. So this is what my styled output looks like. Because I've added that extra custom style sheet and the media test, I can make it a little bit more responsive. I'm showing this just as a demo, so it's really, really obvious, but you can make fairly easily, it took me about 2 minutes to do this, you can make your HTML content react to the window size. So you can make one for desktops, tablets, and then you can make a smaller size one for phone type outputs. You can create the style sheets for each of those types of output in your in Styler. You can export the CSS, wrap it up in a nice media test like this, and away you go. So I just wanted to show you that quickly. So the next bit in here, inside the style sheet properties, is this idea of being able to associate JavaScript libraries. So you can point to something like jQuery if you want to use those with your custom JavaScript functions, and you can call those things in. This will generate links up in the top of your HTML, and you can start using those external libraries. The JavaScript Functions tab, which is a fairly recent addition, that lets you write your custom JavaScript code. So you get a source code editor here where you can write your little bit of custom JavaScript. You can preview it down here, so you can create alerts and you can create active buttons, that kind of thing. And then from the HTML tag category, you can call those. So down here you can see you ask it to call a function. But you can also use the HTML tag category to do other things. So you can specify the HTML tag which gets generated. If you turn on HTML5, you will get HTML5 tags. If you turn on, if you just have default HTML, then you have the default HTML tag set. You can specify attribute values in here, so you can override the class attribute, for example, if you want to, or you can set up events, so like on click, on mouse over, that kind of thing, and then kick off your custom functions that you got generated there. So this HTML tag category lets you fine tune the HTML which would get generated automatically. On my wish list, though, I'm never satisfied with the way Styler is, so I have a longish wish list about what we can do. I want to be able to integrate custom CSS in the way that we have the ability to integrate custom JavaScript. And I also want to do a complete refresh of our web output. So our web output currently looks like it hasn't changed for about 15 years, but I want to make this a lot more modern, make it responsive, and make it look like a sort of modern kind of web output using different structures within it. So looking at this, the HTML chunks will be created in a similar way to the current output, but the framework that wraps it all will be a lot better and a lot more responsive. So that's on my list of things to do. Did we have any questions about the HTML stuff?
Yes, we did. Is there an alternative to the XML format, as this formatting is non-user friendly?
I'm not sure I understand that. Talking about the output that gets generated, or the XML?
Is there an alternative to the XML format, as this formatting is non-user friendly? Is that something you want to perhaps take offline and respond?
Unless it's asking about the style of the XML, the way it's presented inside editor. Yeah. Whoever asked that question, if they could email me, then that would be fantastic, and I'll take that up. Okay. So the last bit is talking about the app print config files. So when you go to print, you can select a print configuration file. There's the standard appcf file, which is there by default for PDF configuration, but there's also a postscript.appcf file, which is used for configuring your PostScript output. And as Patty said earlier, from 8010, you can publish again to PostScript, which is absolutely awesome. So if you want to use Distiller instead of our direct PDF publishing capability, then you can do that now again with PostScript. So the print configuration files let you set up default print options, but they also let you do a whole bunch of cool things as well. And that's the reason why I wanted to talk about these things. So it might surprise you to learn that you can do cool things like creating multiple outputs. You can create app files doing different parts of the formatting process. You can set up custom document properties. You can generate checksum files. You can also customize the scripting all via the print configuration files. So the root element of the print configuration file is the app config element. With that element, you can include other print configuration files in your print configuration file. So if you have a bunch of default options, you can pull those in by default, but override them with your local stuff. Within the app config element, you can have print, format, and document properties, and I'll talk about those separately in a sec. But then you have the magic stuff under format, hooks, and debugs, and I'll talk about those in a little while too. So the print element is a container for a bunch of printer types. So PDF printer is one of those printer types, but so is PostScript printer, PNG printer, and TIFF printer. So if you wanted to, you could have a PDF printer and a PostScript printer and a PNG printer and a TIFF printer active in your print configuration file at the same time. You can only have one of each, but you can have multiple different types. So what this allows you to do is, if you wanted to, you could generate a PNG with the first page of a document as well as the PDF file. Or you could create a PDF output and a PostScript output at the same time if you wanted to use the PostScript output for creating a different flavor of PDF. All of those printers contain an output range, so you can specify the start and end page of the range that you want to output to. The end page by default is set to -1, which means just print everything. You can also specify an output file name. So if you wanted to output your PNG to somewhere specific, then you can do that too. through this option. There's also this idea of document properties, so you can specify output document properties, which are slightly different too. So what I wanted to emphasize here is that PDF and PostScript aren't the only things that you can print to. You can also output to graphical formats, and you can generate multiple outputs at the same time using one print configuration file, which is pretty cool. The PDF printer sets up the PDF output properties and behavior. Okay, so within there, you have things like compatibility. So if you want to output to PDF 1.3 instead of PDF 1.7 or PDF 2, you can do that. And you also have sort of standard support within there as well. So if you want to force it to output to PDF UA, you can do that through the compatibility area. You can specify things like color profiles within the PDF printer, which you might want to embed. You can specify how to handle images. You can specify compression. So one of the questions I get asked quite a lot is how can I use something like Distiller's compression options to downsample my graphics? Well, you would do that through your print configuration compression options. Okay, and the options there are very, very similar to Distiller, unsurprisingly. So you can do it that way. There's options in there for fonts, so how much you want to embed your fonts. How you want to handle interactive options, how you want to open the file. So when the PDF file gets created, how you want it to open, whether you want to open like full page or a specific view or that kind of thing. You can also set passwords on your PDFs through this option too. So if you want to restrict printing from a PDF, you would do that through your print configuration file. Inside PostScript Printer, there's some other options, how you can embed extra commands inside there, how you would embed fonts, how different media are handled, default page sizes, that kind of thing. And also color options, which are inside there too. I will hurry up a little bit, Melissa, because I think we're running out of time slowly. Inside the PNG and TIFF printers, there are options for setting up resolution, and obviously, as I mentioned earlier, there's a page range. So you can use PNG to create a thumbnail that you would display on your web page for somebody to click on, and they would take you to the PDF if you wanted to do that kind of thing. Right. The format part of it lets you set up how APP will format the document. Okay, so there's a passes option. By default, APP will format the content a minimum of 2 times, but a maximum of 6. But you can tell it to only do 4 if you want to. You can also tell APP how it knows when formatting should finish. By default, we check that no content is changing between formatting passes. So generated context like cross-references and indexes, we make sure that those don't change, but you can do it based on a checksum value if you wanted to do that kind of thing. You can also set up some document properties inside this element too. So if you want to specify some default document properties or some custom document properties, then you can do that there. This magic stuff here is really for the stylesheet developer that lets you do some sort of different things. So with format hooks, it lets you embed custom scripting within your formatting process. So you can execute custom scripting before, during, and after the formatting process. You can completely override the formatting process if you want to. And each of those scripting things can be linked to an external JavaScript file, or they can be within a CData content, which is within that section in the print config file. The debug bit allows you to save or print APP files or PDFs doing different formatting passes. So if you wanted to create an incremental PDF of each formatting pass to see where the differences are, to see possibly where some content cross-references are getting muddled up, then you could set up the debug to print to save a printed document every time it does a formatting pass. You can see that through there. If I can find it quickly, I can show you here. The print config file is editable in editor, and we provide a schema for it, so you can see what the allowed values are at different places, and what the default properties are for those attributes, that kind of thing. This is the best place to make changes to your print config file, and it will save you an awful lot of bother getting things wrong, that kind of thing. So have a play inside there and see how you get on. And I think I've run out of time, and I think I've run out of things to say.